as discussed in the Vedas and the Upanishads, and as elaborated in the Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. So we discussed about the creation of the universe. Now, the creation of the universe is a central concept in Vedic philosophy. Every Upanishad that you go into will start off by having a detailed discussion on creation, the nature of creation, the purpose of creation, and so on. So, just to summarize in brief what the creation is, creation of the material world, that is the Jada Prakriti, comes from the Mula Prakriti, or the primordial matter. Now, before creation, the primordial matter is in suspended animation in the Supreme's belly. The Jivas are also in suspended animation, and they are also placed in the Supreme's belly, so says the Vedas. The Shri Tattva, the Lakshmi, she is also in the belly. Chaturmukha Brahma is also in the belly. So every sentient being that is known in existence is in the Supreme's belly. And then the creation comes about. So there are two aspects to this creation. One is the creation of the material world, which is the evolution of the subtle matter to grosser forms of matter, ultimately resulting in the solid state of matter. It's what we call as Prithvi. So you have the Panchabhuta creations, which is a final set of creations that comes. Before that, as we discussed, there is Sattva, Rajas, Tamas, there is Mahat Tattva, there is Ahankara Tattva, there are three types of Ahankara Tattvas. Each type becomes either Tanmatras and Panchabhutas, or Manas, Buddhi, and the various components of this. So this primordial soup or the stew is then made ready for Chaturmukha Brahma and the Ahankara Tattva Abhimani Shiva to then start their creation. And then the Jada, the universe comes into being, which is what we call as the Brahmanda. So now this slide, the evolution of living beings, the one that is right in the middle, Srimad Bhagavatam, essentially we discussed this quite a lot. This summarizes the stages of creation. So Bhagavata Purana tells us that as per the Vedas and the Upanishads, creation happens in 9 stages. The first 5 stages is what I have told you so far, which is the creation of the 24 tattvas. This is called Prakrita Srishti. So Prakrita Srishti is these 24 tattvas then make matter. Okay. Then the 6th stage, we very briefly touched upon it before. Now the 6th stage is important. So this particular verse says, Shashtastu tamasaha sarge yastu abuddhi krutaha prabhoho. So what it essentially means is, the 5 stages, all these matter and everything has been created. Chaturmukha Brahma now is just waiting to create and bring the souls into being, i.e. give the souls their bodies and bring living beings into creation. So we are in that situation. At that time, the verse here says, Abuddhi Kritaha. Abuddhi Kritaha means even without Chaturmukha's knowledge, or akasmat as we call it in Sanskrit, suddenly there was ignorance was also created at this point. Tamasaha means, tamas means ignorance. Tamas has various connotations in Sanskrit. It can mean ignorance, it can mean darkness, it can mean that inertia, it can mean a type of guna, it can mean something that is very bad and so on. So there are various connotations, but here it means ignorance. So in the 6th stage, ignorance was created, or ignorance came about without Chaturmukha Brahma's control. And the next word gives us a hint as to who brought this. It says Prabhoho. So Prabhu there is the God himself. So that is the Supreme Vishnu, Narayana himself brought this ignorance also into his creation. Now the reason why bringing this ignorance into creation is very, very important. It's a key concept in Upanishad philosophy, is the creation of ignorance, or the bringing about of ignorance into creation. If, for example, there was no ignorance at all, we would not be having this discussion at this point of time. We don't need to know about the Vedas and Upanishads, because we would all be knowing this already. So that ignorance, the concept of ignorance, it is a positive entity. Ignorance is not absence of knowledge. So that is one view. It's a negative view of ignorance, is absence of knowledge is ignorance. No, according to Vedic philosophy, ignorance is a positive aspect. It's a dravya. It is a material. It is an aspect of creation that is brought about. And this happens during the 6th stage of creation. So I would want you to think and hold on to that idea of creation of ignorance in the 6th stage of creation, because that is key for the journey of the soul, which we are going to deal today and hopefully next week. Now in the 7th stage, so now we have the primordial prakriti, the jivas are coming into creation, and we discussed that before, that the creation of living beings is as per evolution. It fits very well with Darwinian evolution. In fact, it's a bit more complicated and much more scientific and rational, I would say, compared to Darwinism or Neo-Darwinism. So the Upanishad, the Bhagavatam in this canto and also in the previous canto would say, first microbials came out in the sea, and then the plant kingdoms came. And the 7th stage of creation is the creation of the plant kingdom. And it goes on to say there are 6 types of plants. Then in the 8th stage, animal species were created, lower species initially. And in the 9th stage of creation, man was created. So the bringing about of living beings started from microbials, and it evolved in different stages. Finally, it became man. Man was created. Okay. So that is the appearance of the living beings. Now, the concept of ignorance, as I said, was created in the 6th stage. Now, the same Bhagavatam, then it goes, if you look at the 7th stage, if you look at the 2nd verse, it talks about how plants are. Plants have, plant kingdom has got the highest amount of ignorance that surrounds them. It goes on to say that they do have consciousness, that they do suffer, and they do have experiences of the external world, but their amount of ignorance is very high. So in that sense, the evolution of living species is, as we go to higher forms of life, the intensity and the scope of ignorance also comes down. And it is generally believed that the human species is the most evolved species on earth with least amount of ignorance. We can debate about that at this point of time, whether we are really enlightened species or not. But at this point of time, compared to a tree, our ignorance is substantially less. Okay, so that's something that I hope I have conveyed this information with this slide, that ignorance and that the intensity of ignorance that evolves as you become higher species. Now, we also discussed last week about souls, the atomicity of the souls, and that they are always in constant communion with the Supreme, and they are in that space which is in the thymus gland. Okay, so we discussed, and I think I provided enough evidence to say that souls exist. Okay, now the key question here, maybe we'll pick it up in our discussion section, and this is a core concept in Vedic philosophy and Vedantic philosophy between various schools. So the question is, who has ignorance? So I have told you about the Bhagavatam, the 6th stage, and the various jivas have ignorance with various intensities. Now this is a key question as to who has ignorance. So do the jivas have ignorance, or Brahman himself, Brahman or the Supreme God himself has ignorance? Okay? So there are 2 schools here. So the Vishishtadvaita and the Dvaita school of Vedanta would say jivas have ignorance, and that's called Swabhava Ajnanavada. Advaita takes another view, and it says it is not the jivas who have ignorance, it's Brahman who has ignorance superimposed on him. So I just want to introduce this concept. Maybe we discuss this later. Now the next question is this ignorance real, or is this ignorance mithya or unreal or illusory? That is the next question. Then the third question is, what is this ignorance about? So those are the 3 fundamental questions that the 3 schools of Vedantas try to address to try and understand our own purpose of existence and why we need to make this journey. So I've just put this as a question mark for us to perhaps go back and do some homework. But to summarize this slide, the key message there is that ignorance is there. Now, we also discussed the verse from Shvetashvatara Upanishad, which also comes in Mundaka Upanishad and also in Rig Veda. Dvasuparana Sayuja Sakaya Samana Vriksham Parishashya Jate Tayor Anyaha Pipalam Swadvati Anashna Nanyaha Avichakashiti. So we spoke about these 2 birds, how the other bird is constantly looking at the external world and eating the fruits and suffering, and there is the other bird who is a silent witness, who is just looking at this other bird. So the other bird which is eating all these fruits of the external world is in ignorance. It still has not realized its own position, and it has also not realized that there is an eternal witness that is sitting next to it, or which is actually inside him, and he's unaware of that. That is what the primary ignorance there is, that has actually made this bird go around the external world and suffer and go through samsara. Okay, so that gives you the context or the foundation where we move on to the next slide, Abhijit. So now the key concept here is, we discussed about ignorance. Now, Shvetashvatara Upanishad says, samsara moksha sthiti bandha hetuhu. It describes this man, describes this deva, as Shvetashvatara Upanishad likes to describe God as deva, and it says he is the one who has given samsara moksha sthiti bandha hetuhu. Hetuhu means he is the reason for that. Hetuhu means reason. Bandha means bondage. Okay. Now, samsara, moksha. Samsara means bondage in samsara. Moksha means release from this bondage. Okay. So this Upanishad clearly is telling us that it is the Deva or the Brahman himself who is responsible for putting us into this bondage. Okay. Now, I put on the right side, I give a bit of an analogy here of a prisoner going into a prison. So he is locked up in a cell. So the person has locked him up, holds the key. Okay. Now, Skanda Purana then gives another very interesting analogy here. Bandako bhavapashena bhavapachashta mochakaha kaivalyadaha param brahma vishnureva sanatana. So what it's saying is, Bandako bhavapashena. He is the one who has locked us in this samsara. Bhavapashashta mochakaha. He is the one who has to release us from this bondage. And who is that person? He is Kaivalyadaha, he is Param, he is Brahma, he is Vishnu, and he is Eva, and he is Sanatanaha. So it gives various attributes and descriptions of the Supreme Lord who has actually put us in bondage. Gita, if you go to chapter 15, 15th verse, Sarvasya cha aham hridi sannivishtaha mattaha smritir jnanam apohanam cha. We saw this before last week. So smriti is memory, jnanam is knowledge, apohanam is ajnanam or ignorance. So mattaha smritir jnanam apohanam cha. I have given the souls the memory, the knowledge, and also the ignorance. So from these various scriptures, we now understand that ignorance that has befallen on the souls, and that ignorance that has led us to this bondage in the samsara, is actually being put by the Supreme Being before we came into existence, before we came into this universe with a body. Okay. So now, what is our journey? Once we realize this, that we are in bondage because of our ignorance, now we need to somehow get ourselves out of this bondage. Somehow we need this person to unlock us and release us from this bondage. Yeah. So that is what the very first sutra of Vedanta Sutra of Veda Vyasa, as we all know, and we discussed this before. Om Om Atato Brahma Jignasa Om. So that particular verse, the Atataha, is a big word, is a big Sanskrit word, but split into various ways. We can spend time discussing this later, but by and large, you split it into Ata, Ataha, and Brahma Jignasa. Brahma Jignasa is easy, inquiry into Brahman. Ata means then, Ataha means therefore. So then means once there is eligibility, then, and as Brahman inquiry is absolutely essential for release from samsara or bandha, therefore inquiry into Brahman shall begin. Okay, so that is the core essence of this particular sutra, but this is called Jignasya Adhikaranam. So Jignasya Adhikaranam, the very first sutra, Brahma Sutra, is the foundation of philosophy for various Vedantic schools. Now, for example, from the school I come from, there are 3 volumes of text written about just this particular sutra. So does Sri Bhashya of Ramanuja and also Shankara Bhashya. So they deal with Jignasya Adhikaranam in some detail. Okay, so he who has locked us in has to remove the lock. Yeah, so that is a key concept that we need to understand.
HinduKnowledgeAcademy.com will celebrate Vedic culture and present its philosophies to the modern Hindu in an accessible format. Our ancient heritage is our greatest strength. Through preservation and dissemination, together let us spread positivity in the world. Thank you for listening and welcome to Hindu Knowledge Academy.